ORF Sound. Hört. Festivals mit Ö1.
So we're doing all of this to specifically focus on the relationship between the state and citizens and the media. And so we don't look at the shooters. We're not interested in shooter psychology. We're not interested in necessarily even looking at the lives of those who've passed, but we're really looking at structural violence at play, why it's permissible, and the rise of the surveillance and police state as seen through this archive over time.
Willkommen bei der Ö1 Sommerreihe zur Ars Electronica 2026. In dieser Podcast-Serie kommen internationale Kunstschaffende und Forschende zu Wort, die mit ihrer Arbeit neue Perspektiven auf Technologie, Gesellschaft und unser Zusammenleben eröffnen. In dieser Folge spreche ich mit den US-amerikanischen Filmschaffenden Ryat Yezbick und Milo Talwani über Waffengewalt in den Vereinigten Staaten und ihr Projekt The Innocence of Unknowing. Dabei handelt es sich um eine KI-gestützte Animation, die danach fragt, wie Amokläufe und Massenschießereien durch Nachrichtenbilder vermittelt und mit der Zeit vielleicht auch normalisiert werden. Die beiden Kunstschaffenden haben die Berichterstattung US-amerikanischer Medien über Amokläufe seit den 1960er Jahren analysiert. Es ist ein Multimedia-Projekt, bei dem die beiden in Dialog mit ihrem eigens entwickelten KI-Agenten ihren essayistischen Film zu dem Thema live performen. The Innocence of Unknowing wird beim Prix Ars Electronica mit einer Anerkennung in der Kategorie New Animation Arts gewürdigt.
You've said before that as Americans, you've never known life without gun violence. And according to CNN, there have already been at least 31 school shootings in the US this year alone. For many people outside of the US, that is something that is really hard to comprehend and feel what it's like to live in that situation and reality. How was it for you also growing up? How were you told and taught about the possibility of a mass shooting in your school or university?
It's an interesting question because Milo and I think Milo were 10 years apart?
Something like that, yeah.
10 or 11. So we would have gotten very different instructions around this growing up. I don't know, maybe Milo, you had more drills, but we didn't have drills when I was growing up because it was relatively newish. But now I teach at a university and, part of the onboarding is like going over what to do in the event of a mass shooting. It is very ever present here, unfortunately. And something that you just kind of, as a young person, I'll kick it over to you, Milo, watching that, it's like you're seeing this stuff unfold on your television and then you're going into public spaces every day, right? And so that kind of dissonance, that cognitive dissonance that occurs for, I think, most Americans, which is this one of, the separation of that won't be me, that couldn't be me. And you often hear people on television iterate that after being caught in a mass shooting, which is, I can't believe this happened to me, even though we know statistically it's very possible and very high that it could. So I think that the coverage of these things, of watching these things, at least for me when I was growing up smartphones and, easy access, constant access to the news on your phone, right? It was you're watching this stuff inside your home before you venture out into the world. And I think there's this dissonance there that really plays into how Americans kind of, at least of my generation, viewed and experienced mass shootings. But Milo, how old were you?
Yeah, I mean, you saw, I was Columbine, which was the mass shooting that resulted in that phenomenon being like a household concern in the United States. And to the extent that any of it has affected some public policy. That was 1989, so I was 3. So all of my time in public school has been in the wake of that. I talk a little bit about some of this stuff in the piece, but when I was 10, this boy on my school bus my little sister's best friend at the time was like him and his whole family was shot by his dad. There's not words for that stuff. But just like from, in elementary school, it's like you are with people are there and then they're not. The threat of it becomes mundane or something you're disassociated from, which is deeply disturbing and dehumanizing.
And that experience also, or part of that experience, also forms the backdrop of your recent project. For listeners who haven't seen it yet, what is the Innocence of Unknowing? What happens? And how would you describe the project in your own words?
Yeah, so The Innocence of Unknowing is a multi-channel, multimedia performance and installation project that really engages an AI we trained to think like a humanities scholar. So Milo and I teamed up to kind of tackle this archive that I had amassed over probably 5 years' time, just before the pandemic and then through the pandemic and to present day, right? So I was kind of just online looking at news coverage and looking for news coverage of mass shootings because I saw one particular coverage just happened to come on in a public space when I was out, one day, and it was of a particular shooting that happened at YouTube's headquarters just south of San Francisco in California, and the imagery of that particular shooting of people exiting buildings during a mass shooting really stuck with me, and so I amassed this large archive of over 800 plus clips of news media of mass shootings. And then Milo and I took that archive and fed it to an AI we trained to think like a humanities scholar and trained this AI to really understand and know this archive. And from that, we engaged in what is sort of a Socratic dialogue with this AI about what it was seeing in the imagery. And from that, sort of crafted this multimedia installation and performance where we engaged this AI that's named Aurora in front of a live audience as we ask it what it thinks is happening in certain clips of the footage. And the way the sort of piece is designed is, we sort of start in the past and we move to present day through various sort of topics. So we cover how social media has been functioning as eyewitness news in the United States around this issue, how people are filming themselves fleeing and why people are filming themselves fleeing a mass shooting. We talk about legacies of white supremacy and how that has very much so impacted the issue of mass shootings in the United States. We talk about the demonization of trans people by the far right, specifically as it relates to gun violence in the US. We look at choreographies of retreat, as we call them, as designed by the US police force, which is informed by US military tactics around how to get people out of a crisis situation. And so we're really looking at what is the choreography at play in these moments that are unfolding in public. And when we do all of this, we also look at the use of the word terrorism and who it's reserved for and why. And right, so we're doing all of this to sort of specifically focus on the relationship between the state and citizens and the media. And so we don't look at the shooters. We're not interested in shooter psychology. We're not interested in necessarily even looking at the lives of those who've passed, but we're really looking at structural violence at play, why it's permissible, and the rise of the surveillance and police state as seen through this archive over time. And so that's really what the focus of the work is actually about. And so this sort of structural Socratic dialogue with this AI allows us to look at what the AI thinks is happening and to start bringing in this question of how AI, which is now a massive surveillance technology, is also informing what we know and how we see these instances, how we get information, how our bodies move in moments of crisis. AI and information technology is really key to how we move in these moments and how we get tracked as well. And so the incorporation of AI into this really allows us to have that larger conversation.
You trained your AI agent to see through the lens of humanity. So you fed it certain texts, certain perspectives that you wanted it to also have. So to kind of represent also what is important to you. You also talked to that AI agent. What did you want to find out? How did you want to have the AI analyze all of this footage? What interested you?
Yeah, we turned 10 texts sort of like foundational humanities texts into a data set used to fine tune the AI, so that we could sort of prod it about its biases and failures to see, and the limits of what those tools could do, and the limits of what the sort of, yeah, the massive technical infrastructure that was underpinning the whole thing, the manner in which it failed to do the thing it was intended to, sort of see, and analyze accurately, and the sort of like its ultimate inability to do anything at all relevant about the situation on the ground in America.
Um, I'll be very honest. I don't think personally and maybe Milo, you feel differently, but that there was anything that the AI told us that I didn't already know and that I didn't already think. It just was capable of saying things sometimes very poetically when we pushed it. Sometimes we'd ask it, "What do you see happening in this footage?" And if we asked it generically, we'd get a generic answer. And then we'd come back and we'd say, "Well, can you analyze this segment now from the position of an abolitionist?" And then we'd get the kind of language we wanted, right? That was more of what we wanted to say. So I can't say it necessarily said anything that we as makers, as artists, didn't already feel and know, but it did allow for this sort of reveal, as you mentioned, right, of when the AI got it wrong. We could then use that to show to the public, right? Like, these things are not reading situations in any form of necessarily detailed accuracy. And now we know, right, that there are so many terrifying AI war programs that are used in killing people indiscriminately all over the globe, right? And particularly in Palestine. And so killing children and people who are just innocent, right? And bystanders. And so I think that by showing that in this project, there's also space then to go, these are not the autonomous infrastructures or technologies that we're being told that they are, that they do take human direction and need to have humans prompting. Like, there's still this pipeline at present and at play that I think it gets elided all the time. I think for us, part of the piece is then we want the audience to ask, who does it benefit for us to believe that these systems are more sentient, autonomous, et cetera, than they really are, right? And who does that then excuse or make, I think it kind of creates a space for tech oligarchs to kind of then excuse themselves as saying they're not responsible when they are very much so behind the architecture and infrastructure of these tools and how they're being used. So there is this very political stance and position for integrating AI into the project in that regard.
Ryat Yezbick kommt aus der bildenden Kunst und beschäftigt sich mit Körper, Erinnerung und der politischen Dimension des Beobachtens, gerade in einer Zeit digitaler Überwachung und dezentraler globaler Konflikte. Dabei reichen die Ausdrucksformen von experimentellen Dokumentarfilmen über Installationen und Live-Performances bis zu Zeichnungen. Im Mittelpunkt stehen Themen wie Sicherheit, Gender, Heimat, Familie, Liebe, Gewalt, Macht und Verantwortung. Milo Talwani ist Filmemacherin, Komponistin und Technologin und lebt in Los Angeles. Zu ihren jüngsten Arbeiten zählen der Film Dog Movie von Regisseur Henry Hansen sowie die Orchestrierung der französischen Erstaufführung von Ted Hearns Oratorium Plays. Ryat und Milo unterrichten derzeit beide im Programm Narrative and Emerging Media am Los Angeles Campus der Arizona State University. Ihr Projekt The Innocence of Unknowing wurde 2025 bei Tribeca Immersive, einem Programm des Tribeca Film Festivals in New York, erstmals gezeigt. Im Zentrum steht dabei auch unsere eigene Rolle. Was bedeutet es, Zuschauerinnen und Zuschauer solcher Gewalttaten zu sein? Und wie hat sich die Medienlandschaft verändert, durch die wir diese Bilder im Lauf der Jahrzehnte wahrnehmen?
Could you now talk a little bit about what you found out, what you pointed out, what kind of stories are shown, what kind of stories are not shown, and how does language play a role in how those events are mediated and remembered?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just say that, like, again, the title goes back to this, is we are told to be shocked every time that this happens. in the way that these events are covered. We are told that this is just another senseless tragedy, that somehow, right, the inferred understanding there then, or the inferred, clause that is not included is like, because we cannot stop this, when we very much so can stop this. And so this like idea that we somehow are powerless is what we as Americans are meant to feel when we engage with this issue of mass shootings. We are meant to feel disempowered, right? And so why are we meant to feel disempowered, right? And who does that benefit? And so I think, again, like these kinds of questions are the things that I want people in the United States to be thinking about, but also around the globe, right? We are at a moment where we have to be looking at how we are being asked to respond to moments of crisis, what parts of our rights we're being asked to hand over in moments of increased chaos. All affects how we are able to then stand up for our own rights in public spaces, hands down. And so the semantics then again as well of terrorism. I mean, in the United States, I'm Lebanese American, and the word terrorism for mass shooting only ever gets used if the perpetrator is Arab and or Muslim. And so it's not used when it's a white male shooter. And so the reason why, right, is because Americans have this legacy and this history. The political stance here is very Islamophobic, right? And there are geopolitical interests with labeling people of Arab descent who may or may not be Muslim, right, as a terrorist because it serves geopolitical interests at home. And so, yeah, we really try to interrogate that in this project. Like, why is this reserved for only Arab people? Why are we not calling white supremacists terrorists? Because we still to this day don't use that language regularly with white supremacist terrorists in our country. And again, who does that benefit? Well, I think that's very obvious right now in terms of our political climate here in the United States. But again, also around the globe, the rise of white supremacy is not a US issue alone.
Yeah, it was really interesting to like watch the footage of mass shootings in like the 1960s and 1970s and how differently that stuff was depicted. To see people who didn't know that like the way that you were supposed to respond was to put your arms up in that position, who didn't know that if you show up at the scene of a shooting with a gun, you're likely to be perceived as the shooter and might just be shot on sight as happens. And it was interesting to be like, I had never really considered, how do I know to make it clear in my body that I am vulnerable, defenseless, not a threat. And it was really fascinating to see people learn that, to see people learn those choreographies over 60 years of live news media coverage of mass shootings in America.
And something that has also changed a lot since the 60s is, of course, the rise of social media, which has also influenced the news coverage. And you also talk about that in your project, that today many images of mass shootings come not only from journalists, but actually from people who happen to be there and record it and share it online. And what ethical questions arise when people record and share violence in real time, and when news organizations then use and distribute those images?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is it's a complicated nexus, right? I think on one hand, we have to ask, why are we recording ourselves when we're fleeing for our lives? And I think for every individual, that's probably a slightly different answer. But I think Milo and I really wanted to include this portion because it is an evolution in eyewitness news. People didn't used to have cell phones. An eyewitness news reporter was historically a photojournalist on the ground, not in a helicopter or, remote piloting a drone, but a photojournalist on the ground with a camera, multiple photojournalists on the grounds with cameras, right? Filming something happening. And that was the way that the public was able to see what was going on. But now everybody can record themselves. And so news organizations are licensing that footage, that social media footage after it's been posted. I think the most telling to me in those instances is not only people actively filming themselves while they're running, Like one of the things that forensic specialists who go into a mass shooting area after a mass shooting, they find cell phones that are still recording, you know, because people record and then they drop their phone. So what is that impulse? It's a very documentarian impulse to to be witnessed, to be seen in a moment of crisis, to validate your own experience, right? But also, I would argue, puts you in danger because you're not focusing on the moment, you're focusing on what is happening to you through a mediation, right? Through a mediation of your phone. And I think that that's probably psychologically just something people do because it's terrifying and it allows them to have a buffer. A lot of students film themselves, and I just think it's really telling.
After spending so much time on this topic with the footage, what do you think are actually the root causes of gun violence in the United States? And what can we do to tackle them? What can actually be done to reduce gun violence in the United States?
It's capitalism is my flippant answer. Yeah. Right. Could probably talk more eloquently, but yeah.
That's a very big question, I think, in some level too, right? Like, right, what is the root, did you say, of gun violence, specifically in the US? I mean, yes, I agree with Milo that, I mean, the United States has a history, right? It's just if you look at the history of this country, it's incredibly violent. You had people who came and settled this country and committed a genocide against Native people in order to colonize the land and became an empire off of a slave trade, right? And a production of so many various materials that fueled the, industrial age, and that all came at the cost of so many lives. And I think that that kind of legacy of violence and extraction has to be maintained through violence, right? That kind of level of production and that kind of world domination has to be maintained through violence, and that doesn't come without a cost. So some of my favorite authors really look at the ways in which who study gun violence in the United States. They look at the ways in which American imperial war efforts abroad throughout the 20th and into the 21st century have come home to roost, meaning we send folks abroad. And in the case of Vietnam, we had a lot of soldiers come back who did not get social services, did not get welfare, and turned to violence within their own country because they didn't get the help they needed. So, for instance, the 1966 University of Texas Tower shooting, which is where we start our films, it was a Vietnam vet who came home who commits that shooting. So, I think when we look at the, sort of legacies of hegemony and global domination, it's with a cost and it does come home to roost.
And would you say it is necessary, or is it even possible now with this history, with this legacy? I guess there are also a lot of very powerful people opposing that, but to ban guns, is that utopian now, or do you think this is something that could or should happen in the near future?
There are regularly laws passed sort of like restricting specific kinds of guns and categories of guns you can own. Those laws get repealed, all of which are sort of like about US citizens. The police are not giving up their guns. No politician in America has, to my knowledge, done anything meaningful to even like question the extent to which police are armed, the US military is armed, who we give bombs to. And it seems like there is some political will occasionally to tackle some of the guns in society, which are like the guns owned by civilians. There is no political will, it seems like, in the United States or elsewhere to say, and the government also should not have machine guns and the ability to kill dozens, hundreds, millions of people. Do I think it's utopian? I have no evidence that the people who benefit from these structures have any interest in getting rid of the structures that benefit them in my lifetime. And I haven't seen evidence of sort of like mass political, cultural movements of people willing to try and force them to.
Yeah, I would just say, like, yes, we need to get rid of firearms. I think we are told often that it's not a possibility because there's too many guns. And I again think that's just something we are told so that we don't mobilize effectively. Will it be challenging? Absolutely. People are fighting for this every day in our country, just even to get the simplest of restrictions on, machine guns and AR-15s and AK-47s within the hands of civilians. People are trying to restrict that, and that's even sometimes a challenge. So that tells you a lot about the influence of the NRA, the National Rifle Association in the United States, which also has a very interesting political history with the U.S. police force, actually. And so just a whole another topic. But yes, I think it's possible, but I think it would be a lot of hard work, continual hard work.
Yeah. But you see hope, or you see hope also in like a civilian movement or demonstration that you could change the situation in your country.
I mean, I think Americans and people who reside in the United States are waking up really fast to the political reality that we need to fight for our rights on all fronts. And so I do think people are getting better at protesting, learning how to protest, organizing, learning how to organize smartly. All these things are changing very rapidly here because of our environment and our political environment. And so, yes, I do think there are countless organizations, often started by the parents or partners of folks who've been killed in mass shootings, who are, advocating for these kinds of reforms every day.
Thank you both very much for your time in this conversation.
Thank you, Hannah. It's really great to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you.
Das waren Ryat Yezbick und Milo Talwani im Ö1 Festival Guide zur Ars Electronica. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören. In der nächsten Folge geht es um digitale Überwachung, marginalisierte Gemeinschaften und spielerischen Widerstand in Ghana. Zu Gast ist die ghanaische Soziologin und Community-Aktivistin Madia Sieber. Das von Sieber entwickelte Computerspiel Adventures of the Witch's Garden macht Erfahrungen von Ausgrenzung auf spielerische Weise erfahrbar.